I'm in from the garden with this morning's picking of yellow squash. This is also called summer squash. It's one of the more popular squashes that's out there, and it's really good for you. I love to pick this squash when the blossom is still on it, so that the diameter is only maybe 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches at the most. If the squash gets too big, like these big ones right here, then they start to develop the seeds and they kind of become seedy. But if you get them nice and thin, like these down here, then they are just absolutely great. And we got lots and lots of freeze-dried yellow squash. And I was thinking, instead of freeze-drying, slicing these up and freeze-drying, well, why not make some squash flour? Now, if you haven't heard of squash flour, it is a really neat thing to make. Squash flour is real popular for those people on a keto diet, and if you're gluten-free like my wife is, it can come in really handy. And if you Google the price of squash flour, it will amaze you. A pound of squash flour can be as high as $20 a pound. And squash flour is high in antioxidants, vitamin A, vitamin C, and you can use it in pastries, and you can make icing, mousses, beverages, baking, cereals, porridge. Squash flour is really versatile. So I'm going to go ahead and save the smaller yellow squash for freeze drying, and then some of these bigger ones, I'm going to put these aside, and we're going to make some squash flour. And it's pretty easy stuff, especially if you have a freeze dryer. So I'm going to send this to the food processor. We're going to clean everything up, take off the ends, send it through the food processor and grate it up, and then we're going to go ahead and put it into the trays, pre-freeze it, throw it in the freeze dryer, and then once it comes out of the freeze dryer, we're going to throw it through the food processor again and turn it into a powder. This may seem to be an impressive amount, but it really isn't. Summer squash or yellow squash is 95% water. So once the water is removed out of this, there's going to be very little material left, and that's probably one of the reasons why this is so expensive. Now, one of the things I like about squash flour is making a puree that goes along with beef, whether it's like London broil or a roast beef or steak. Squash puree is really, really good. And you can also make baby food out of it. Of course, this has not been cooked yet, so whatever you're going to do with the squash flour, it does need to be adequately cooked. So we're going to see how much I have of this. So I have 1,950 grams of squash. So I'm going to put 976 grams of squash in each of my Harvest Right trays. And you can just feel how much water. It's almost like walking through a puddle. This stuff is really heavy with moisture. Now, don't be fearful of loading these trays up. In many cases, you can fill your trays quite full with food. The most important thing is the heat has to be able to transmit through the heaters in the shelves into the pans and through your food. If you have really good contact and to smash the food down nice and tight where the heat can move through the food, you'll still get really good sublimation. So this is ready for the freezer, and I always pre-freeze my food. I started off with 3,411 grams of squash, and by the time it went through the freeze dryer, it was 268 grams. So altogether, this is about 93% water. So there's not going to be a whole lot of powder left once we grind this up. So that's the next step. I'm going to send this through the food processor and grind this up really nice and fine to make the final product, which is squash flour. this is squash flour. Now squash flour can pretty much be made out of any squash, but summer squash or yellow squash is usually the most popular. And we're going to go through some of the things you can do with this. One of my favorites basically is to make a puree that would go with beef. So you can just mix this with a little bit of water to reconstitute it, throw some butter, salt, and pepper, and it's a great side dish for beef, for steak, London broil, whatever it may be. Baby food is another thing you can use with this. You can use this as a thickening agent. You can make porridge. You can add it to baked goods. And if you have a hard time getting your kids to eat vegetables, you can put this in with spaghetti sauce and they'll never know the difference. We're going to make some chocolate chip cookies. Those are my favorite cookies, but because I can't have chocolate, I'm going to have to use carob. So you have to forgive me for that, but that's the only way I can enjoy cookies that have somewhat like a chocolate chip in it. But this recipe is my recipe. I'm very proud of it. I developed it on my own, and it's a guy recipe. And what I mean by that, this is one of those recipes you just throw everything together and you just beat the crap out of it. So we're going to start, and the recipe will be in the video. But to start with this, we have 2/3 cup of shortening and 2/3 cup of margarine. Now, I've tried making this using butter in the past, but butter has a really low melting point. And if you use butter, you can, but you might have to add a little bit of extra flour or your cookies are going to be kind of flat. So in this case, this is the only time that I would really use margarine. So we're going to put this in the microwave until it's liquefied. That's a guy thing. So this is a melted shortening and margarine, and we're going to go on to the next step, which is the easiest of all the steps. We're just going to pour it into a mixing bowl. We're going to pour that into the mixing bowl, and we have a cup of brown sugar. We have a cup of sugar. We have 3 eggs, and we have a tablespoon of vanilla, and we have a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda. Now you can end here, but what I think I really like about this recipe are the next 2 ingredients. This is a 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract and a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. If you don't like those 2 items, you don't have to put them in, but I think it makes all the difference in the world. Now I'm going to put this into a mixer, and I'm going to beat this thing at a high speed until it goes to a creamy, like a creamy tan color. So I'm just going to beat the crap out of it to get to that texture. So this is the color you want your batter to be, kind of a creamy white color. Now normally this is where I'll then add 3½ cups of flour and the chocolate chips to make my cookie dough. Well, we're going to do something different. We're going to split this batter, and we're going to use flour on one side, and we're going to take flour, regular flour, wheat flour, and squash flour for the other side. So we're going to have cookies that are made with 100% wheat flour, and cookies are going to be made with 50/50. And then we're going to have a taste test to see if they can notice the difference. It's one of the ways you can sneak some nutrition into a chocolate chip cookie. I divided my batter into 2 equal portions, and my original recipe called for 3½ cups of flour. So we divided that in half, which came out to 1 3/4 cup here and 1 3/4 cup here. So this is regular wheat flour that we're going to add to our batter. And then on this, we're going to divide that even up, and we're going to add 7/8 of a cup of wheat flour and 7/8 of a cup of squash flour. And the squash flour is made from yellow squash. So we're going to go ahead and mix these up and get ready to add the chocolate chips or the carob chips. The next step are the, I hate to say this, the carob chips. how I miss my milk chocolate chips, but this is what I have to do so I don't get a migraine. And mix this up. The carob chips are mixed in, and you'll know if you did it right because this will be a very sticky batter. So when we make the cookies, these are going to have to be dropped with a spoon because it will be a very sticky batter. Don't try using your hands. Now at this point, since we're getting ready to put the batter on the cookie sheets, go ahead and set your oven for 375 degrees, and we're going to cook these for 10 minutes. So I can tell the difference between the two cookie sheets. This is the cookies with the squash flour. I'm just going to put a little dab of batter right there so I know which ones is the squash flour. Both of these are ready for the oven, and we'll see what happens in 10 minutes. So the cookies are all out of the oven. These are the ones with squash flour. These are the regular ones. And from first appearance, I left both of these in for 10 minutes. The ones with the squash flour, I probably should have pulled them at 8 minutes. So should have, would have, could have. They're not burnt, but they are a little bit darker than these other ones. So that's just something, if you're going to go down this route, go for 8 minutes instead of 10 minutes. So we're going to try one out and see how it goes. I need some milk. Okay, not bad there. Now the regular ones are absolutely delicious. These have just the slightest little bit of a aroma to them. Kind of makes you think twice, but you really can't put your thumb on it, but you really can't tell the difference. But these actually turned out pretty good. So I'm going to pass them out to my family. Unfortunately, my wife can't have these because these do have wheat flour in them, and I'll see what they think about it. For dinner, we got one of my favorite cuts of meat. This is a London broil. It's kind of somewhere between steak and a rump roast, but I love the London broil. And we're going to go ahead and marinate this. And I have all my ingredients in a Ziploc bag. I have a half a cup of olive oil, a tablespoon full of lemon juice, a teaspoon salt, teaspoon pepper, teaspoon onion powder, teaspoon garlic powder, and a teaspoon paprika, all inside of here. Just going to kind of mix this up, and we're going to put the London broil in here. Get as much air out of here as we can. So I'm going to let this sit for about an hour, and one of the side dishes we're going to have is going to be yellow squash puree made out of squash flour. To go along with our London broil, we're going to have a squash puree made out of squash flour. I have 1 cup of squash flour in here, and I'm going to reconstitute it with hot water out of the tap, just a little bit at a time, because you can always add more water, but you really can't take it away if you put too much in. Looking for a creamy consistency. Now we don't want to get this too wet because we're going to be adding a little bit of butter with this that will act as a liquid, salt and pepper, and just a little bit of brown sugar. This is 2 teaspoons of butter, a teaspoon brown sugar. And I decided to put an extra teaspoon of brown sugar in there. And just a little bit of salt and pepper to season to suit your taste. So we're just going to put this by the side for right now, and we're just going to heat it up when we serve the London broil. We're ready to cook the London broil, and I'm going to use avocado oil because that oil can go really, really hot without smoking. So we're going to put some avocado oil in there, and we're going to get this pan really, really hot to sear the outsides of our London broil. Our oil is smoking hot, which it should be. Now I'm going to take this out of the bag, but I want to keep the marinade. Do not throw the marinade out. And we're going to lay this down away from me because it's going to snap, crackle, and pop. And you know what Gordon Ramsay says, no color, no flavor. Almost there. I'm going to take this off. I'm going to let this rest for a few minutes. Now once this is well rested, I'm going to cut this in some very thin pieces. I'm going to take the extra marinade we had left over and put back in the pan here. And I'm going to just make a little bit of a reduction on this. So I want to watch this closely because we do not want to burn the garlic. This next step is where we kind of have to move kind of fast. I'm going to flash char the meat. Kind of have to act kind of fast because we don't want to end up overcooking the meat. But we just want to char the outside to get some of that flavor back. And then we add the squash puree. It was made out of squash flour. And maybe my plating needs some help, but there we go. Squash flour, squash puree, and my favorite way of making London broil and a small baked potato is my dinner for tonight. The uses of squash flour are unbelievable. There are so many things you can use squash flour with. So I suggest and urge you to give it a try to see how it works out with your family and with your family's diet. And at this time of harvest, who doesn't have a few extra yellow squashes that they could freeze dry and powder? I hope you found this informative. It's something I've learned, and as I've said in the past, go forth and freeze dry the world, and please subscribe. Thank you for your time.